access to treatment long-term is an issue when we are becoming dependent on this. I would say that one thing that people need to consider is availability of testosterone. This is not the easiest thing to consistently get access to depending on where you live. And it seems to be getting more difficult in certain countries with government regulations changing around these things. So one thing that I think is very important, and this is, I speak to a lot of guys about this. If you are severely hypergonadal, then even if testosterone's availability is suboptimal in the future, the risk to reward ratio is very heavily in favor of reward. If you have terrible hypergonadal symptoms and your levels are crashed out to nothing naturally, if you lost availability to testosterone and your natural production came back even 20 or 30% lower, worst case scenario, if you couldn't get access to it, if you went from terrible to slightly more terrible, you're going to be playing in the same ballpark. And I think that you've got not nothing to lose, but it's a much easier decision to make if your hand is forced in that regard. One thing that a lot of guys are doing these days is they may be recognizing that their testosterone levels are suboptimal and they're wanting to go on TRT to optimize their testosterone levels rather than being completely deficient. And I think that this is a much more tricky scenario for guys to look at, is going, okay, all the research says that if you go on TRT and you stop taking TRT, even without a PCT, your levels will come back 100% perfect. In practice, that is not true. And I think every practitioner could attest to that, is going, yeah, look, in reality, not the case. Some people can stop TRT and get their exact same levels back, adjusting for age. If it's been a few years or 5 or 10 years, they're going to be naturally a bit lower because of aging. But there are also plenty of guys, particularly guys that I see under the age of 25, where they disrupt their natural production once, even with doing TRT, not necessarily anabolic steroids. And even after doing the perfect PCT, whatever they think that is their levels will come back significantly compromised from where they were before, maybe 20, 30, 40, 50% lower. So this is something that guys really need to consider, is if you're not necessarily hypergonadal, and yeah, maybe you could benefit from having more testosterone. I mean, I think almost all men could. I guess the question that guys need to ask is the juice worth the squeeze, in terms of, is shutting down my natural production and creating an acquired hormone deficiency and an exogenous hormone dependence, like a type 1 is dependent like a type 1 diabetic is dependent on insulin. Is this the best strategic move forward for me in getting the outcomes that I'm wanting to do? And a lot of the time, these guys can have much more, not much more benefit, but I would argue equal benefit to really dialing in their diet, lifestyle, exercise habits, removing their vices, doing these things to get a better subjective experience of how they're feeling. And if all of those pathways are maxed out and they're still not feeling well, and they're like, look, I'm in my mid-20s, I'm in my early 30s, I'm doing everything perfectly, and I just, at best, I feel like a 6 out of 10, even though I'm doing everything right, then yeah, I think it is something to look into. But the biggest consideration from a logistical standpoint, because we can talk about all the health stuff, which I think is important, but TRT is just as much of a logistical thing as it is a health thing. It has to be done. Otherwise, it's all just hypotheticals. So access to treatment long-term is an issue when we are becoming dependent on this. And I think guys really need to think twice in terms of understanding that the future of testosterone availability, I would hope it's going to get a whole lot better. More clinics are entering the market. There's a whole lot of money to be made in prescribing testosterone. Free market attracts this. I mean, my undergrad's in business, so it makes sense for the industry to grow. And that's fantastic. More competition in the field is massively beneficial for the consumer, because it increases quality of service and it makes people compete on price. That's fantastic for the consumer. But testosterone is very heavily scheduled, very heavily regulated by the government. I've done 3 lectures on the war on masculinity, and I think that there isn't, I personally, I mean, I'm pretty far down the rabbit hole, so each to their own, but I think there is an agenda to reduce availability of testosterone and increase prescriptions of things that basically increase your response to operant conditioning, which is SSRIs. We know that testosterone makes men less likely to follow rules based on what's been studied. So I think that that's something that guys need to take into consideration, is availability combined with lifelong dependence, and having your life force not manufactured endogenously and dependent on government supply. And I'm just going to talk about pharmaceutical grade stuff here, which is the most important thing that guys do, is don't inject shit into your body and bypass your immune system that you bought on the internet. Like, don't do that. But that creates a very unfavorable combination. But For a lot of guys, the risk to reward ratio is in favor of reward, but I think it's something the guys need to ponder about before they make the plunge.
Yeah, very great point. I'm with you in the rabbit hole, and I see the agenda of the globalists. So yeah.
Oh, I know you're thinking of.